believe there's 6 or 7 new members of the board
Yes,
to
sir.
be seated either last meeting or the meeting before last.
Okay, thank you.
Any further questions on this item? Item D on the agenda this evening, contract parkland drainage improvements. Mr. Lawton.
Thank you, Mayor. Members of the board, there were several drainage improvements and parkland improvements incorporated in this year's budget in the infrastructure replacement program. The board is asked to approve a contract for one of these for drainage improvements at the soccerplex adjacent to Germantown Middle School and the lacrosse fields at Johnson Road in the amount of $69,915. We're also recommending that we take, in addition to the base bid of $63,916, alternative number 1 in the amount of $6,000. This item is budgeted. We'll also point out to the board, when we get to that section of the budget where we're talking about budget amendments, I'm going to hand out a revised budget amendment dealing with this particular project as well as the pour-in-place work that was done at Dogwood and Riverdale Elementary School.
Budget adjustment, not
Yes.
a budget amendment.
I'm sorry, Mayor.
That's
Yes,
all right.
budget adjustment.
Any questions for staff on this particular item? Item 9E, donations, Park and Recreation.
Yes, Mayor, we've received donations for the Parks and Recreation Department. Our folks in this community are excellent at contributing to programs throughout the city, and so there are 2 budget adjustments accepting the revenues, one in the amount of $1,264 and the other in the amount of $250. The budget adjustment taking these funds from the revenue account where these dollars come in and putting them back into not back into, but placing them within the Parks Department.
Thank you, Mr. Lawton. Questions for staff? And Director Beasley or Leslie Acera or our clerk can provide you with any names and addresses if the board chooses to send any thank you notes. Item F on the agenda, grant Whole Kids Foundation Farm Park. Mr. Lawton.
Very successful grant award, Mayor and Board, in the amount of $2,000 that will enhance the farm 4-H garden project that was prepared. The grant was prepared for that intent, and it will create an edible garden program at the farm park.
Thank you, Mr. Lawton. Questions for staff? Item G on the agenda, Public Education Governmental Disbursement to GMSD third quarter. Mr. Lawton.
This is the quarterly payment, third quarterly payment to GMSD, who serves as the city's public access studio. They operate the public access studio at Houston High School. Funds that the city receives from our 2 cable providers, AT&T and Comcast. A portion of that goes to support these public access stations. This is not incorporated or this is not a part of the city's maintenance effort because it's going for capital to support the high school studio.
Thank you, Mr. Lawton. Questions for staff on this particular item? Item 9H, Purchase Network Annual Maintenance. Mr. Lawton.
Thank you, Mayor. This is the annual maintenance agreement for 17 locations throughout the city for 40 pieces of Cisco network hardware. You can see those areas listed under the discussion component. This is a critical purchase. It's budgeted for this year to support our city's network and our phone system licensing.
Thank you, Mr. Lawton. Questions for staff on this item? Very well. Item I, Purchase Public Safety Software Annual Maintenance.
That annual maintenance software purchase is with Tyler New World Systems. They are the software suite that is used by the police and fire department personnel to manage all their departmental operations. The annual maintenance allows for periodic software updates and 24/7, 365 support.
Thank you, Mr. Lawton. Questions for staff on this item? Mr. Sanders.
I was just curious, does this represent an increase or is it about the same as last year?
It's a slight increase. Typically, they increase 3% or so roughly every year.
3%. I would have called and asked you, but I saw on your email that you were off, so thank you.
Any other questions for staff on this particular item? Item J, Purchase UPS Replacement and Maintenance. Mr. Lawton.
UPS, Mayor and Board, stands for Uninterruptible Power Supply. This will be the UPS system located here at City Hall to support the city's main network systems for computer, AC, all the other network systems installed in the city. The UPS allows our batteries to kick in the time of a power outage before our generators have the opportunity to kick in, and just creating a very safe and redundant environment.
Thank you, Mr. Lawton. Questions for staff on this particular item? Item 9K, reimbursement, payment number 6, GMSD school security improvements. Mr. Lawton?
Thank you, Mayor and Board. As you recall, there was $500,000 allocated in this year's budget for various security improvements that GMSD had requested throughout the district. We have made to date four reimbursements. We have provided four reimbursements to the district out of that $500,000 in the amount totaling $306,830. This next request before you this evening is for $27,412.72. We anticipate that the balance of the $500,000 will be presented to the Board of Mayor and Aldermen at the last meeting in June, assuming we get the invoices from GMSD to process those.
Thank you, Mr. Lawton. Questions for staff on this item? That is the conclusion of the preliminary agenda. We move to the regular agenda. Item 10, ordinance number 2019-1, ordinance to adopt the FY20 budget, second reading and public hearing. Mr. Lawton.
Mayor, I'll be very brief because we have a presentation we're going to be making this evening. It's based on the work session that we had with the Board of Mayor and Aldermen at the end of April, I believe it was, prior to the first reading on the budget. The amendments that Alderman Yonda had recommended and was approved by this body have been incorporated into the budget ordinance that is before you this evening. That's dealing with the grant that we received for the Grove, also incorporating additional paving for street paving program and putting putting a park project funding in place. But rather than try and get through that in a couple of minutes, I will save that for our presentation this evening.
Thank you, Mr. Lawton. Questions for staff on item 10 this evening? Very well. Item 11, ordinance number 2019-2, year-end budget adjustments, second reading and public hearing. Mr. Lawton.
Mayor, and there again, I will review these in more detail during the presentation, but I would like to hand out to the board 3 budget adjustments that needed adjustments. One is dealing with the pour-in-place concrete, and that one project I mentioned earlier regarding the drainage at the lacrosse fields and the soccer complex. That's absolutely a change in how we're addressing that, but the other 2, change order 101 and, change order 98 and 100, something happened in terms of putting together the budget change orders, budget adjustments, and not all the information was provided in your packet, and I apologize for that. So I want to hand out the revised ones that reflect what took place at the first reading, in addition to the change I made on 101. But I'll pass these this way if the board would take those. And then when I get into the presentation on this, I'll go through those in more detail. We did add 2 additional budget adjustments for the board's consideration. One is 19-12 or 112 dealing with e-citations, and the other is carpet replacement, budget adjustment 19-113 at the Great Hall.
Thank you, Mr. Lawton. As those are being passed down, Alderman Yonda, if you could get the extras to the clerk would be great. Any questions for staff on these on this particular item? Item 12 on the agenda this evening, ordinance number 2019-3, real and personalty property taxes, second reading and public hearing. Mr. Lawton.
Thank you, Mayor and Board. This is the public hearing on the tax rate. There's no recommended change to the tax rate. The administration's recommendation is it stay at its current rate of $1.95 per $100 of assessed valuation.
Thank you, Mr. Lawton. Questions for staff on this particular item, on item 12? Very well. Item 13 on the agenda, ordinance number 2019-4, Germantown Municipal School District year-end budget adjustments. second reading, and public hearing. Mr. Lawton?
Again, Mayor and Board, much like the city's budget adjustments, what you're doing when you approve the budget adjustments, you're actually adjusting the budget, the approved budget for FY19, how we end the fiscal year. It's very important for auditing purposes. The same holds true with GMSD as they bring forward various budget adjustments that will impact the district's budget. Attached to item 13 are those various year-end budget adjustments that have been recommended by the superintendent and approved by the GMSD school board.
Thank you, Mr. Lawton. Questions for staff on item 13 this evening? Item 14, Ordinance 2019-11, Amendment to Fire Prevention Ordinance, Chapter 10, first reading and set public hearing. Mr. Lawton.
Yes, Mayor and Board, Chief Selberg and Fire Marshal Jody Dwyer are here, and they'll make that presentation this evening. But this is amending the city's fire prevention ordinance. It hasn't been done in a number of years, and staff is prepared to present that this evening. A companion piece to that would be item number 15, which is the first reading affecting the residential sprinkler ordinance that also is before you for first reading and to set a public hearing.
Thank you, Mr. Lawton. Questions for staff on item 14 on the agenda? Item 15 on the agenda, the companion piece, Ordinance 2019-12, Amendment to Fire Prevention Ordinance, Chapter 10, Residential Sprinklers, first reading and set public hearing.
Yeah, Mayor, no further comments on that.
Presentation was just made a moment ago. Any
Yes, sir.
questions on this particular item? Item 16, Ordinance number 2019-13, Amendment to Subdivision Ordinance, Chapter 17, Section 17-56, Streets, first reading and set public hearing. Mr. Lawton?
Mayor and Board, this is before this evening, a planning department, ECD rather, department presentation. This is to keep that section of our subdivision ordinance in step with the proposed amendments being made to the fire code ordinance before the board this evening. You're asked to consider this on first reading and set the public hearing. Mr. Ross will make this presentation.
Thank you, Mr. Lawton. Questions for staff on this particular item? We've reached the conclusion of both the preliminary and the regular agenda. Executive session is adjourned.